The Saturday market in O'Neill smelled like horse dung and fried onions, and the particular kind of desperation that comes when a county has gone dry 2 years running. I remember the exact temperature of that morning, cold enough that my breath came out in small clouds, warm enough that the mud hadn't frozen back solid, so every step I took across the market square left a boot print that filled slowly with gray water. I was 18 years old. I had one cow. Her name was Vera, and she was a 6-year-old Holstein with a white patch above her left eye shaped roughly like the state of Ohio. She weighed about 1,100 pounds, and she was, as of that Saturday morning, April 14, 1934, the last living thing on 80 acres of Holt County, Nebraska, that belonged to me. The men at the market looked at me the way men look at a boy when they've already decided what they think of him. Quick eyes, then away. The kind of look that isn't dismissal exactly. It's something colder. It's the look that says, "I've already accounted for you. You're the Marsh kid, the one who inherited the problem." My grandfather, Edmund Marsh, had died on Valentine's Day that year, pneumonia. He was 63, which should have been young enough to survive it, but the previous winter had taken something out of him that wasn't strictly physical. He left me $12 in a coffee tin, a 1927 John Deere Model D with a cracked manifold, and a debt of $310 owed to the First Holt County Savings Bank on Fremont Street. The loan officer, a gray-suited man named Dale Sutter, had handed me a written warning on April 3rd, 11 days before this market morning, informing me in precise, unhurried language that the next installment of $48.60 was due by August 31st, 1934, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the property. $48.60 by the end of August. I'd done the arithmetic a dozen times, walking the fields at dawn, standing in the empty barn, sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown paper sack. The numbers came out the same every time. Vera, sold at current prices, would bring $18 to $22. The tractor, non-functional, would bring less than that if I could find a buyer at all. The winter wheat I'd managed to get in the ground had come up sparse and yellow. There was nothing else. So I led Vera down the county road to the Saturday market, tied her rope to a post near the east end of the square, and stood there waiting. That was where I saw him, a lean old man in a canvas coat, sitting behind a converted grain wagon stacked with seed packets and glass jars, a hand-lettered sign nailed above his head reading, W. Greer, Seed and Feed. He wasn't doing much business. A few women had stopped to look at his seed packets, then moved on. A man in overalls had picked up a glass jar, turned it over, set it back down without a word. The old man didn't seem to mind. He sat on an upturned crate, elbows on his knees, watching the square the way you watch weather, patient, without expectation. I watched him for a while from across the lot. Then I walked over. His table held maybe 40 varieties, each one labeled in a careful penciled hand on scraps of brown paper. Mortgage Lifter Tom. Early Galahad Corn. Bloody Butcher Dent. Carlin P. At the far end of the wagon bed sat a burlap sack the size of a feed bag, folded over at the top and tied with a piece of twine. No label that I could read from where I stood. I asked what was in it. He looked up at me, pale eyes, the kind of pale that comes from decades of looking into bright sky, and said, Pole beans, old variety, Harlan Climbers. I asked if they were any good. He said they were better than good in dry years. I turned the words over. Dry years. It was April, and already the subsoil felt like chalk when I drove a fence post. The county hadn't had a real rain since February. I asked what he wanted for them. He looked past me at Vera, tied to her post 20 yards away. He looked back at me. He said the sack ran about 4 pounds of seed, enough for a half-acre planting if I didn't waste any. He said he'd take the cow. I stood there long enough that a man behind me cleared his throat, wanting to get by. 4 pounds of bean seed for a Holstein worth $18 on a good day. It wasn't a trade, it was a surrender. I knew it, he knew it. But I thought about the wheat coming up yellow. I thought about August 31st. I thought about the arithmetic that kept coming out the same, no matter how many times I ran it. A cow gives milk and eventually meat, but she costs feed I didn't have and solves nothing by September. I untied Vera's rope and handed it across. He didn't gloat, didn't even nod much. He just handed me the sack, and I felt the weight of it, maybe 5 pounds with the burlap, and thought, this is what I traded my last animal for. I was partway back to my wagon when I heard it start. 2 men from the hardware side of the square, then a third voice I recognized as Herschel Pruitt's, carrying across the lot with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting all morning to say a thing. Dumbest trade since the Indians sold Manhattan. I kept walking until the wagon was between me and the square, and then I stopped walking. The sack was sitting in the wagon bed. 4 pounds of dried beans in a burlap half-sack, the word climbers penciled on the fold, the ink gone soft with age. I stood there with my hand on the wagon rail and looked at it the way you look at a thing you're not sure yet whether to be ashamed of. The drive back was 11 miles on a road that hadn't been graded since October. I had the sack on the seat beside me, which was stupid, but I didn't want it rattling loose in the back. The sky was the color of old canvas. No clouds. There hadn't been real clouds in 3 weeks. Just that flat yellow-white that sits over the county like a lid on a pot. I kept thinking about what I'd say if anyone asked. No one would ask. That was the thing about living alone. There was no one to explain yourself to, and no one to tell you you'd done right. Both of those were the same silence, and I hadn't learned yet how to tell them apart. I got home sometime after 2. The farmyard was quiet the way it only gets when there's no animal left in it to make noise. No Vera shifting her weight in the stall, no chain against wood. I went into the barn anyway, out of habit, and stood in the dark of her empty stall for probably longer than I should have. Then I went inside and put the sack on the kitchen table and sat down across from it like I was waiting for it to say something first. I hadn't eaten since morning. There was cornmeal, and there was lard, and there was a jar of last summer's tomatoes going soft at the lid's edge. I made something out of that and ate it standing at the stove, because sitting down to it alone at the table felt worse than not sitting down at all. After supper, I went to the root cellar. Not for any particular reason. I went there when I needed to think, the same way some men go to a porch or a woodpile. It was cool, and it smelled like clay and old iron, and the vinegar from the jar rack, and those smells had been there longer than I had been alive. I took the lantern. The root cellar ran the full width of the kitchen above. Stone walls, packed dirt floor, the jar rack along the north wall, a broken butter churn in the far corner I'd been meaning to move for 2 months. I'd cleared the front half when I first moved in. The back half I hadn't touched. I set the lantern down and started moving things. Not looking for anything. Just moving. That was when my boot caught the floorboard. It caught on the edge and lifted. Not like rot, not like accident. Like it had been set that way. Deliberate. A board cut short of the joist and laid back over the gap without nails. I crouched down. The lantern threw my shadow up the stone wall behind me. I got my fingers under the edge, and the board came free clean, no resistance. The way a thing comes free when someone has lifted it before. The hole underneath was maybe 8 inches square, packed dirt at the bottom. And sitting in that dirt, a tin box, the kind tobacco came in, oval, flat, the lid pressed down tight. The metal had gone dark, but it hadn't rusted through. Someone had wrapped it in oilcloth before they set it there, and the oilcloth had done its job. 40 years in the ground and the tin was still sealed. I didn't open it right away. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a moment. The lantern hissed. Somewhere above me the house settled. That sound it made at night, a low tick in the beam over the kitchen, like the wood was still deciding whether to hold. I thought about my grandfather, about whether he had known this was here, about whether he had put it here himself, or inherited the hiding of it the same way I was inheriting everything else: the debt, the cracked manifold, the $12 in a coffee tin. Then I peeled back the oilcloth and worked the lid. It opened with a sound like an exhale. Inside, wrapped in a single fold of muslin, was a small book, leather cover, the size of my palm. The leather had dried and cracked along the spine, but it held. I opened it under the lantern. The handwriting inside was small and even, slanting slightly right, written with a confident hand that didn't waste space. At the top of the first page, inside the cover, a name, written in ink that had gone brown. Nora E. Marsh, her record, begun April 1894. I turned the page. It was a planting journal. Dates in the left margin, plant names in the center column, notes in a second hand that was slightly looser, added later, I thought, after the season, when she'd seen what held and what hadn't. Turnips, winter squash, a variety of onions she'd gotten from a woman in Stewart. The entries were methodical, unsentimental. She wasn't writing for anyone to read. She was writing so she wouldn't forget, and so whoever came after her wouldn't have to learn the same things twice. I turned pages carefully, the muslin across my knee. The journal ran to 1901. 7 years of this ground, recorded in a hand I had never seen before tonight, by a woman who had worked this same half-mile of Nebraska before I was born, before my grandfather was grown, before any of us had a word to say about any of it. I kept reading. The entries for 1894 were sparse: cold spring, 2 rows of potatoes lost to a late frost in May, a note in the margin, replanted June 3rd, came in thin, and then nothing else until August. I read that and thought about my own potatoes, the ones I hadn't put in yet because the ground still had no moisture worth speaking of. The 1895 entries were fuller. She'd gotten her rhythm by then. Squash hills along the south fence. Dried beans from a neighbor in Atkinson that she called Atkinson Longs. Good producer, she wrote, but slow to dry. A small stand of sweet corn that she gave up on after the 3rd year. She was learning what this ground would do and what it wouldn't, the same way I was learning it now, 40 years later, like the information hadn't been sitting 20 feet below the kitchen floor the whole time. I turned to 1896. The handwriting tightened at the start of that year. I could feel it in how the letters sat on the page, closer together, more careful. The spring entries noted a dry March, a dry April. By the June entry, the word dry appeared in nearly every line. Then, on July 12, 1896, a longer entry than anything before it. I read it twice. July 12. A seed man came through from O'Neill, name of August Greer. Sold me 4 pounds of pole bean seed he called Harlan Climbers. Said they come out of a family in Harlan County and have been through worse than this. I was doubtful. But the price was fair, and I have nothing better to try. Put them in the ground the same afternoon on the south slope below the barn. Strung twine from the fence posts. The ground is cracked, and I do not know what they will do. I stopped. August Greer. I set the journal down on my knee and looked at the cellar wall. The single candle threw a long shadow across the stone. I thought about Walt Greer and his converted grain wagon on the east side of the Saturday market, and the sack of seeds sitting in my kitchen right now, labeled in pencil in Walt's own hand. Harlan Climbers. And the way he'd said, "Those beans no dry ground," like it was something he'd heard before he knew what it meant. I picked the journal back up. The July entry continued below, in the looser second hand. The notes added after the season was done. These held 6 weeks without meaningful rain. Every other bean row I put in failed by August. The Climbers did not. Harvested in September, enough dried bean to feed this family and the Erdmans next door through January. Kept 2 pounds of seed. August Greer deserves to know. I turned the page. The August entries were where the real numbers would be. I turned the page. The August entries were written in a different ink. Darker, wetter, like she'd pressed harder. The handwriting was still hers, but it moved faster. Something had shifted in her by August. Something had been proved. August 3rd, 1896. The climbers are climbing. 3 weeks without a drop, and the lower field is gone entirely. Corn is finished. The early bush beans are black and flat, but the pole beans on the south slope are still reaching. Leaves look heavy in the morning. I do not understand it. August Greer said the seed came from a man in Harlan County who'd held it since before the drought of '88. Said it learned something. I did not know seed could learn. I am starting to think it can. I read that sentence twice. August 14th. No rain. Ground has gone to powder in the low field. I walked the trellis line this morning at first light and counted the pods. 41 plants. The longest pods are nearly a handspan. I picked one and split it. 3 beans inside, dark purple, firm. The Erdman girl came over with her mother. Mrs. Erdman did not speak, but she looked at the vines for a long time. I sat with that image. A woman standing at the edge of a bean row in 1896, looking. August 22nd. Still nothing from the sky. Corn County is finished for 30 miles in every direction. I have heard this from the men coming through. But I have beans. I have beans on a south slope below a barn on 80 acres in Holt County, and I do not know what I did to deserve it, except I planted what August Greer told me to plant. There was a gap of 3 days, and then... August 25th. Brought Mrs. Erdman a quart jar of green beans, shelled. She cried. I did not know what to do, so I stood there. Her husband has gone to find work in Omaha. She has 4 children under 10. I told her the dry beans would be ready by September. She asked me how many I could spare. I told her I did not know yet, but we would not let her go short. I do not know if that was the right thing to promise. I closed the journal on my thumb to hold the page. Outside, the root cellar door sat in its frame above me, and above that, the April dark, and the half-acre of south slope I had not yet planted, still waiting, the trellis posts already sunk into the cracked Nebraska soil. My last cow was gone. My banknote was due in 4 months and 19 days. I had 4 pounds of seed in a cloth sack in my kitchen, and a journal written by a woman who had stood where I was standing and made a promise she didn't know yet if she could keep. I opened the journal back to August 25th and kept reading. The August 25th entry was 3 lines. Climbers still setting pods. No rain in 19 days. The Hendersons asked if we could share. I told them yes. That was all. No explanation of how she knew they would have enough to share. Just the yes, already given, already committed, the way you commit to a thing before you fully understand what it will cost you. I read past August into September. The handwriting got smaller as the pages filled. She was conserving paper, or her hand was tired, or both. September 4th. First dry pods ready. Shelled 2 quarts. September 9. Pulled 6 plants. Good seed set on all. September 14th. Yield better than 1890 plot by a wide measure. Gave Henderson family 1 bushel dried. Still have more than enough for winter and seed both. I sat with that for a while. She had planted a half-acre, same as I was planning. She had gone 19 days without rain in August, and the vines had kept setting pods. In 1934, the weather reports I had been listening to on the Erdman's radio, because mine had stopped working in March and I had not been able to fix it, said June and July would be dry. Everyone in Holt County already knew it. You could feel it in the soil when you pushed your boot into it. The ground did not give. But she had done it in 1896 with half an acre and no trellis notes beyond poles, 8 feet, wire between. I turned back to the April entries. April 19th, 1896. Set poles today on south slope below the barn. 8 feet, driven 2 feet deep, wire strung at 1 foot, 3 feet, 5 feet. Ground soft enough still, won't be soft long. South slope below the barn. I had sunk my trellis posts in that same slope. I hadn't known why exactly, it had just seemed right, south facing, good light all day. But she had been there before me, 38 years before me, on the same hill, with the same seed, driving posts into the same ground before it hardened. I stood up. My knees ached from the cold of the root cellar floor. I climbed the wooden steps and pushed the cellar door up and came out into the night. The sky was enormous. Out here it always was, but some nights you forgot until you looked. The trellis posts were 30 yards away. I could see their silhouettes against the sky, the baling wire catching just enough starlight to be visible, strung in 3 rows the way she had written it, 1 foot, 3 feet, 5 feet. I had 4 pounds of seed in a cloth sack on my kitchen table. I had read enough of the journal now to know what those vines could do in drought. Tomorrow I would plant. I planted on April 18th, a Wednesday, before the sun cleared the tree line to the east. The seed was cold in my hand. I had sorted through the 4 pounds the night before at the kitchen table, working by lamplight, discarding anything shriveled or cracked. I ended up with roughly 3.5 pounds I trusted. I put the rest back in the sack and set it aside. The ground on the south slope was still soft enough to take a dibble. I had an old one hanging on the barn wall, a hardwood handle with a pointed iron tip, carved with initials I had never bothered to read. I took it down that morning and turned it in my hand. E.M. Edmund Marsh. My grandfather had used this same tool, maybe longer ago than that. I worked each hole 6 inches deep, placed 2 seeds, covered them, moved 4 inches down the row. The wire ran above me in 3 strands, the posts solid in the ground. I had the rows oriented north to south, so every plant would catch the full arc of the sun as it crossed. That was in the journal too. 1 line, May 3rd, 1896. Rows NS, full arc, no shadow loss afternoon. I didn't rush. Rushing in this work cost you. A hole too shallow, a seed placed wrong, and you'd lost that spot for the season. I worked steadily. The birds were loud in the cottonwoods along the creek. I could hear the tractor sitting silent in the shed, which was somehow its own kind of sound, the absence of money moving. I finished before noon. 3.5 pounds of seed across the half-acre, every hole covered and tamped. I walked the length of each row once, just looking, then set the dibble against a post and stood back. There was nothing to see. Brown earth, wood posts, 3 runs of baling wire, a field that looked like nothing, because it was nothing yet. The county relief office was closed Wednesdays. The bank was open. I did not go to either. I went back to the house and read more of the journal instead. I was in June of 1896 now. The rains had stopped. She had written every 3rd day or so, not panicked entries, just observations. Soil cracking at the fence row, corn showing stress, leaves curling by midday, the climbers hold. Checked roots this evening, moisture still present 8 inches down. 8 inches down. That was the thing. Whatever these vines did with their roots, they found water the other crops couldn't reach. She had noticed it and written it plainly. 40 of the most useful words I had ever read. Outside, a wind came up from the southwest. I heard it move through the wire on the trellis, a low hum, almost steady. I left the journal open and listened to it for a while. It was dry wind, the kind that doesn't bring anything with it. That dry wind blew for 4 days straight. I checked the trellis each morning before breakfast, running my hand along the lowest wire the way I'd seen my grandfather check fence line after a storm. Not expecting damage, just accounting. The bean seedlings were up now, 2 inches, 3 inches, the first true leaves unfolding flat and dark green against the pale soil. Everything else in the county was either already planted and struggling, or not planted at all. Herschel Pruitt's corn went in 2 weeks before mine, and I could see it from the south fence. Short, pale, the leaves beginning that midday curl she had described. His field was twice the size of my whole farm. It looked sick already. Mine did not look sick. That was the only word I had for it. It did not look thriving either. It just looked like it was waiting. June came in on a Tuesday with a sky the color of old brass. I had read through to the end of August in the journal by then. I knew what she had watched happen. The corn failed. The oats failed. A neighbor 2 miles north, she called him only H.W., which I took for a man named something Whitmore who had farmed near the creek, lost his entire stand of sorghum to a dry wind not unlike the one I'd just had. She had written his initials down and then written, "Offered what we could spare." Just that, offered what we could spare. I thought about that line more than almost any other. By the second week of June I was down to a half sack of cornmeal, 6 jars of last year's tomatoes, and a wedge of salt pork wrapped in cloth in the cellar. I was not starving. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy, from a distance, to make those weeks sound more desperate than they were. I had enough. What I didn't have was certainty, which is a different kind of hunger, and one that doesn't show in your face the same way. The beans climbed. By mid-June, the vines had reached the second wire, 8 inches up. I measured them with a piece of twine, and then measured the twine against the door frame. I started writing in my own notebook. Not a journal exactly, just numbers. Date, vine height, soil moisture checked by hand at 8 inches, sky conditions. I was doing what she had done. I don't think I understood that consciously at the time. I just knew that writing things down made the waiting feel like work. The rain gauge on the barn post read 0 for the last 11 days of June. I checked it every morning anyway. July came in like a door slamming. The temperature hit 103 on the 4th and stayed above 95 for 11 days running. I could feel the heat through the soles of my boots by mid-morning. The topsoil in the cornfield, 2 rows east of the barn, turned to powder so fine it floated up at a footstep and didn't settle for half a minute. The Pruitt place, I could see it from the south slope, had a full stand of corn in May. By July 8th, the stalks had gone yellow from the bottom up, the way a candle burns. My vines were green. Not thriving. I want to be honest about that. The lower leaves had a curl to them, the edges browning back a 1/4 inch. But the growing tips were green and reaching, and every morning I walked the row and checked each plant by hand, my thumb pressing lightly at the base of each leaf where it met the stem, feeling for softness that would mean rot, feeling instead for the slight stiffness that meant the plant was still drawing something up from deeper than I could reach. I was watering twice a week from the stock tank, 1 full can per 8 feet of row. That was all I could spare. The well had dropped 14 inches since April, and I was measuring it with a knotted rope every 3 days. July 14th, noon. I heard a wagon on the road. It was the neighbor from the east, the one who'd offered to buy the place twice now. He pulled up at the gate, without stepping down from the board, just sat there with his arms on his knees, looking at my trellis line. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Corn's gone." "I know," I said. "Mine too." He said it the way you say something that has already cost you something else to admit. "What are those?" "Pole beans." He looked at them the way a man looks at something he can't quite classify. Not mocking now, just trying to understand how anything was still green in that heat. "Drought-hardy variety," I said. "Old seed." He nodded once. Still didn't step down. After another moment, he picked up his reins. "You'll run short on water before August," he said. It wasn't a threat. It sounded almost like concern, which was stranger than any threat would have been. "Maybe," I said. He drove back up the road without looking at the vines again. I stood there after the wagon was out of sight, looking at what I had. 1/2 an acre. 47 plants still climbing. Soil cracked between the rows in lines so straight they looked deliberate. And somewhere 30 feet down, Water, my rope said, was still there. I went and got the watering can. The first week of August, the well rope came up dry. Not dry like thin water. Dry like rope. Dry like the bucket hit bottom and came back with dust on it. I stood at the well casing for a long time that morning, letting that settle. The sun was already hard at 6:30, and the sky had that white look it gets when the heat means business. I had 4 gallons in the kitchen barrel. I had a half-acre of pole beans 40 yards from the well, climbing wire as fast as anything I'd ever seen, their pods starting to thicken at the joints. 47 plants. I'd counted them that morning out of habit, same as I'd counted them every morning since June. I thought about the journal, the entry from July 1896. Long taproot, drought hardy, give it water in the root zone when you can, but do not despair when you cannot. My great-grandmother had written that, in pencil so fine I'd had to tilt the page to the window light to read it. Do not despair when you cannot. She'd been 17 years older than me when she wrote it, and she'd had 4 children and no husband and a first cutting of hay that had burned in the field standing. She had not had 4 gallons. I took 2 gallons to the beans. I poured them slow, at the base of each plant, moving down the row the way she described. Root zone, not leaf, not stalk. Making every ounce go where it could be used. The second gallon got me through 12 plants. I left the rest for the next morning and went back to figure out what else I had. There was a low spot past the south fence where the ground stayed softer longer, where the grasses didn't go brown quite as fast. I'd noticed it in June and not thought much about it. I walked out there in the afternoon heat and pushed a steel rod down 3 feet, 4 feet, and at 4.5 feet it came up damp. Not wet, damp. I dug by hand for 2 hours. At 5 feet, the soil went dark and clumped. At 6 feet, I hit water that seeped into the hole slowly, brown at first, then clearing. I went back to the barn and found a length of galvanized pipe, a hand pump fitting, and a mallet. I worked until the light went. By the time the stars came out, I had a pipe in the ground and water moving through it. Not much. Enough. I carried 6 gallons to the root zone that night by lamp, moving row to row in the dark, listening to the ground take what I gave it. The pods on the lead vines were already the length of my hand. I could feel them in the lamplight, tight and cool in the heat. August had 10 days left in it. Those 10 days I didn't sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. I carried water every night. 6 gallons, 8 gallons, whatever the pipe would give me before the seep slowed. My shoulders went tight by the 3rd day and stayed that way. I didn't notice much. The pods were swelling. On August 28th, I picked the first dry test pods from the lead vines, the ones that had gone papery and rattled when I shook them. I split one open over my palm. The beans inside were fat, cream-colored, faintly mottled. They looked exactly like the 4 I'd saved in a matchbox back in April and set beside the journal in the tin. I held them under the lantern for a long time. I started harvest on September 2nd. I pulled pods for 11 days straight, working from first light until I couldn't see the vines anymore. I spread them on old window screens in the barn loft to finish drying, turning them twice a day. By September 13th, I had sacks. I counted them twice. 847 pounds. I loaded the wagon on the morning of the 14th and drove into O'Neill. The county relief depot was on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the bank. The man behind the counter weighed each sack himself and wrote the number down in a ledger. He didn't say much. When the last sack was off the wagon, he looked at his ledger and said, 565 pounds, 9 cents a pound. He counted out $50.85 onto the counter. I walked to the bank. The loan officer was at his desk. He looked up, looked at the envelope I set down, looked back up at me. He opened it, counted the bills, wrote a receipt. He slid it across the desk without standing. $48.60. Paid. He stamped the ledger. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. That afternoon I drove the wagon east on the county road and stopped at 12 farms. At each one I carried a sack to the door. Nobody turned it down. The neighbor to the east was the last stop. He opened the sack and looked at the beans for a moment without speaking. Then he closed it and nodded once and went back inside. I drove home in the early dark. I went down to the root cellar and opened the tin tobacco box. The journal was still there. I set 2 pounds of dried Harlan climbers inside, beside it, and closed the lid. I put the box back in the corner under the shelf where I'd found it. If you've ever been handed something that looked like nothing, an old book, a worn-out tool, a name in faded ink, don't walk past it. The people who came before you were trying to tell you something. Sometimes you just have to get quiet enough to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep listening. And if you've got a story of your own buried somewhere, leave it in the comments. I'll read every one.